Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun burned with a cruel indifference over the village square as a crowd gathered to witness the spectacle. At the center stood Chidinma, her once elegant wrapper now frayed at the edges, her arms tightly gripping her trembling daughter, Obiora, who clung to her side like a dying branch to a withered tree. Obiora, the late Emeka's elder brother, stood with a self-righteous smirk, flanked by two local chiefs and a few men from the village council. The air was thick with judgment and gossip. Chidinma, a widow not more than 2 months, was being chased from the home her husband built, the same home where she birthed their twins, the same home where her husband's blood had stained the earth not long ago. The elders, men once respected, now served their own stomachs. They declared with thundering voices and folded arms that a cursed woman has no place in a noble man's house. The whispers in the crowd, the pointed fingers, the children mocking Obiora as she cried. Every detail tore deeper into Chadinma's heart than any blade ever could. As Chadinma and Obiora walked out of the compound barefoot, their belongings tossed like garbage into a raffia mat tied around their backs, her spirit broke. Every step away from the home she once swept daily felt like being dragged across hot coals. Obiora's sobs turned to gasps as she asked her mother why they were leaving, why nobody would listen. But Chadinma could not answer. Her voice was buried beneath layers of grief and injustice. The pain of being widowed, the shock of watching her son's coffin lowered beside her husband's, and now the shame of public rejection. It was all too much. Obiora's final words before she left still rang in her ears. "You were never one of us. You bewitched my brother and stole his life. Go and die elsewhere." Her knees buckled, but she refused to fall. If not for herself, then for the trembling child beside her, she had to keep walking. The once sweet soil of her husband's village now tasted like ashes beneath her feet. As the evening drew close, the two sat by a lonely palm tree on the outskirts of the village, with flies buzzing and goats bleating in the distance. Obiora laid her head on her mother's lap, still trying to understand what curse they carried that made everyone hate them. Chidinma stroked her daughter's hair gently, tears flowing silently as memories flooded her mind. The days when Emeka would laugh while helping Obiora with homework, when they would eat roasted yam together and talk about building a second house in the city. All gone, taken by jealousy, deceit, and greed. But as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Chidinma whispered something into Obiora's ear, something weak yet full of fire. "They threw us out, but they did not bury us. One day you will rise. One day this land will speak your name in gold." Long before tragedy swept through her life like a wildfire, Chadinma had once been a glowing bride with eyes full of hope. She had met Emeka when he was just a lanky, determined youth working at a construction site in Onitsha. He had nothing but a dream, a ragged notebook filled with ideas, and a heart bursting with ambition. Despite being the younger brother to Obiora, the man known in the village for his loud mouth and heavier pockets, Emeka never let inferiority take root. He read books by candlelight, saved every kobo, and poured himself into learning the mechanics of real estate development. By the time he turned 30, he had founded Tech Builders, a construction company that was changing the skyline of the southeast. Chidinma, then a brilliant tailor known for her modesty and beauty, caught his eye during one of his project visits to the village. Unlike others who tried to woo her with lies or empty praise, Emeka came with respect and clarity. He wanted a partner, not a puppet. Their marriage was the talk of the town, not because of its extravagance, but because of its rare foundation, love and mutual respect. Emeka adored his wife, and in her he found peace. They bought land in the village and built a 3-bedroom bungalow for family visits. Despite his booming business in the city, Emeka never neglected his roots. He frequently sent money home, supported the local church, and employed dozens of villagers. Even Obiora, his elder brother, benefited. When their father passed away, Emeka quietly agreed to let Obiora choose the larger portion of the inheritance land. despite being the one who had taken care of the old man's hospital bills. Chidinma often warned him that his brother's envy was festering, but Emeka would simply smile and say, "Let him have peace. I have all I need, my wife, my children, and my sleep." Those peaceful days, though few in number, were golden. The twins Ikenna and Ijeoma brought more joy than Emeka thought possible. But beneath the surface, envy roared like an underground volcano. Obiora resented everything: Emeka's success, the way villagers respected him, and most of all, Chidinma's unwavering loyalty. He couldn't understand how someone like Emeka, who once borrowed his school sandals, now owned houses and cars. His own marriage was bitter and full of quarrels, and he often blamed his misfortunes on the universe that had favored the younger one. Even after being offered a senior role in Emeka's company, Obiora squandered the opportunity with reckless spending and shady deals. Emeka tried to cover up the losses to avoid scandal, but eventually, he was forced to let Obiora go. That moment, the day he was fired by his own younger brother, would forever mark the turning point in Obiora's heart. From that day on, Chadinma would unknowingly be caught in the crossfire of a long-brewing war between blood and bitterness. In the weeks following his dismissal from the company, Obiora spiraled into a cauldron of rage and shame. At every beer parlor he visited, whispers followed. "Nahim younger brother way fire, M.O." The humiliation was unbearable. At home, his wife mocked him for losing the job. His children questioned his authority. And everywhere he went, people sang Emeka's praises. He couldn't escape the fact that Emeka had succeeded where he had failed. But it wasn't just failure that pained Obiora. It was the sight of Chidinma every time he visited the village square. She still carried herself with grace, even in her simplicity. Her gentle laugh, her respectful greetings, her modest head tie that swayed with the breeze. She was the kind of woman he had always wanted, yet could never have. And that envy transformed into something darker. He convinced himself that Emeka didn't deserve her, that she had chosen the wrong brother. To make matters worse, Obiora's greed began to outgrow his reason. He started pushing Emeka to sell off the other half of their father's land so they could develop it together. Emeka declined politely, stating that he wanted to preserve part of it for his children. That refusal ignited an inferno. Obiora began telling villagers that Emeka was planning to sell everything and abandon the family name. He accused Emeka of being selfish, of trying to erase his father's legacy. The worst part? Some villagers believed him. They had always seen Obiora as the elder and thus assumed he was telling the truth. He visited the elders with gifts, goats, cash, palm wine, planting seeds of suspicion and resentment. Meanwhile, Chadinma began noticing strange looks from neighbors and hearing whispers she couldn't explain. Emeka, still trusting in brotherhood, dismissed her concerns. But the final straw came one stormy night. Emeka was in the city for business, while Chidinma stayed back in the village with the kids. Obiora visited, drunk and reeking of cheap gin. He stumbled into their compound, demanding to speak to Chidinma alone. She refused, but he pushed past her, grabbing her wrist tightly. With slurred speech and wild eyes, he confessed his obsession with her, claiming he would have been a better husband than Emeka. When she shoved him away and screamed, he threatened her life, calling her ungrateful. That night, Chidinma bolted the door and wrote a letter to Emeka about what happened. But by the time he returned to confront his brother, Obiora had already begun plotting something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. And thus, the seed of envy, watered with bitterness, began growing into a tree of destruction. The morning after Emeka returned from the city, the air around their compound felt different, heavier, more watchful. Chidinma sat quietly on the veranda, her hands trembling as she held the letter she had written. She had not slept well. Obiora's disgusting advances haunted her like a nightmare she couldn't shake. Emeka's face hardened as he read her words, every sentence deepening the creases on his forehead. He had always been the peacekeeper, the calm in every storm, but this was different. This wasn't about business or land. It was about his wife's dignity, his home. Without a word, he stormed out and headed straight for Obiora's house. Neighbors watched with curiosity as the younger brother barged into the elder's compound like a lion defending its pride. Voices were raised, threats exchanged, and for the first time, Emeka publicly declared that he would no longer be silenced. "You are no longer welcome in my life, Obiora," he said, loud enough for the compound to hear. "If you ever come near my wife again, I will have you arrested." But Obiora, ever the schemer, wore a mask of mock humility. "Ah, is it not just a misunderstanding? You've forgotten I'm your brother? Your elder," he crooned, pretending to be the wounded party. He even feigned a tear in front of those watching, casting himself as the victim of a bitter wife who had poisoned her husband's mind. The elders who were nearby muttered among themselves, some shaking their heads at the drama, while others, already on Obiora's payroll, began to spin the tale differently. That was the danger of a manipulator like Obiora. He didn't need the truth, only a version that served him. Days later, he visited the palace with 3 bottles of gin, 1 goat, and a fat envelope. He told the chiefs that Emeka had lost respect for tradition, that he had brought a woman who controlled him, and that he feared the land would be lost to the lineage if something wasn't done. The chiefs, blinded by bribes and loyalty to hierarchy, nodded in agreement. A plan was set in motion, quietly and quickly. Back home, Emeka remained unaware of the brewing danger. He was busy trying to stabilize his company after Obiora's exit. Unknown to him, his brother had already arranged secret meetings with a gang of local thugs, dangerous young men willing to do anything for money. "Don't kill the woman or the little girl," Obiora instructed coldly. "Only Emeka and the boy." It was not just about land anymore. Obiora wanted to wipe out the legacy of his brother, erase the son who would inherit it all, and seize control. That night, as Emeka tucked his children into bed, as he laughed with Chidinma over the dinner she cooked with love, as he kissed her forehead and whispered dreams about buying a second house in Enugu, he had no idea death was lurking around the corner, summoned not by strangers, but by his own blood. And thus, betrayal became a ticking clock, counting down to a tragedy that would change everything forever. It was a cold, moonless night when the killers struck. They came in silence, dressed in black, faces masked, and hearts emptied of conscience. Emeka had returned from a business trip only hours earlier, bringing with him a toy plane for Ikena and a necklace for Chidinma. The family was in the living room, laughing about Igioma's newest drawing when the power cut off suddenly. At first, they thought it was just another outage. But then, glass shattered. A scream followed. Chaos erupted. Emeka pushed his children behind him and yelled for Chadinma to take them to the back room. He grabbed a stool in defense, but it was too late. A blow to the head with a pipe sent him to the floor. Ikena, hearing his father's cry, ran to help, but one of the thugs lunged forward with a knife. Chadinma's scream that night would be remembered by every neighbor within 10 compounds. Her husband lay still, blood oozing, and her son, her firstborn, lay beside him, lifeless and cold. They left as quickly as they came. No money stolen, no items taken, just blood and silence. The police were called, but nothing useful came of it. The officers chalked up to armed robbers and closed the file. Chadinma sat for hours beside the bodies, numb, broken, and hollow. When the sun rose the next morning, the village gathered to whisper and cry. But some eyes were dry, especially Obiora's. He wept dramatically during the burial, but his tears were too loud, his mourning too rehearsed. "Oh, my brother, my dear brother," he wailed as he threw himself onto the casket. Chidinma watched with disgust. Igioma clung to her hand, trembling. And then, as they lowered the caskets into the ground, Obiora leaned close to Chidinma and whispered so only she could hear, "Now that he's gone, you belong to me. Don't fight it." Chidinma recoiled, her face frozen with disbelief. She wanted to scream, to slap him, to expose him there and then, but she held herself. This was not the place, not beside her husband's grave. Instead, she glared at him, a silent curse in her eyes. That night, he came to their home, demanding entry. Chadinma locked the doors and refused to answer. He banged and shouted for nearly 20 minutes before walking away, cursing her. The next morning, she visited the palace, hoping the elders would intervene. But they had already been bought. They told her to honor the traditions, to submit to her husband's elder brother. When she protested, they warned her that a widow had no place without male protection. 1 week later, they came with a ruling. Chidinma would either marry Obara or leave the compound. With no support, no voice, and nowhere to go, the walls began to close in. Chidinma's final stand was quiet, but powerful. She knelt before her husband's grave, her hands trembling as she placed a single white flower beside the headstone. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I could not save you, and now I cannot save your name." She knew Obiora's ambition was far from satisfied. Even after orchestrating his brother's death and trying to claim his widow, Obiora now wanted full control of the family land. He claimed that since Emeka died without a living son, the land automatically reverted to him. Chadinma protested, saying Ijeoma was still a child and heir to her father's name. But the elders dismissed her. "A girl cannot inherit land," they said coldly. With Obiora pressing them with more bribes and false stories, they declared that Emeka's portion was now Obiora's by tradition. Chidinma watched in horror as workers began to clear her backyard, building a fence that split the land in half, and then encroached further. Despite the humiliation, she tried to stay. She hoped to raise Ijeoma in the only home her daughter knew, to guard the memory of her husband. But Obiora escalated matters. He began spreading rumors that Chidinma was a witch who had seduced Emeka and caused his downfall. He told villagers that her presence brought curses and that Ijeoma was a spirit child. The once warm faces of neighbors turned cold. Children stopped playing with Ijeoma. Chidinma's business as a tailor collapsed. Her thread remained untouched, her sewing machine silent. Obiora visited again, this time with 2 elders and a fake priest, declaring the compound spiritually contaminated. "It is time you leave before more people die," he spat. With a forced decree written on paper and a few paid men, they dragged her belongings out and dumped them in the rain. As Chidinma and Ijeoma stood again in the village square, drenched and shivering, the circle of eyes that once watched them with respect now gazed with contempt. Obiora stood tall, arms folded, victorious. "I warned you," he sneered. "You could have had protection under me. But now you are nothing." Ijeoma buried her face in her mother's wrapper, crying silently. Chidinma did not cry this time. Something inside her had died. Yes, but something else had awakened. With no words left, she took her daughter's hand and turned her back on the land that betrayed her. She walked away without looking back, her eyes fixed on a horizon neither of them could see yet. But deep inside her soul, a vow was written in fire. One day we will return, and this time they will kneel. The news of Emeka's death traveled fast across townships, yet the truth behind it stayed buried under layers of fabricated tales and paid silence. The police quickly labeled it a robbery gone wrong, conveniently brushing off the targeted nature of the attack. But Chidinma knew. She knew it in the way Obiora wept too loudly, in how he clutched Emeka's casket like an actor trying too hard to be believable. She saw it in the way his eyes flicked towards her and Ijeoma during the burial, eyes not of grief but possession. The villagers, ever gullible or simply indifferent to what didn't directly concern them, accepted the narrative. The only thing Chidinma could do now was survive. She had nothing, not her home, not her belongings, not her peace. Every familiar corner of the village now held a memory stained in betrayal. The shadow that had taken her husband was still stalking her and her daughter, waiting to finish the job. But survival in the city was nothing short of a rebirth, a painful, tear-soaked rebirth that felt like crawling out of a grave with bare fingers. Chidinma and Ijeoma arrived in the capital with nothing but a torn bag, 3 wrappers, and a few naira tucked into her blouse by an old woman who had whispered, "Take this and go. Don't die here." The woman, a distant cousin of her late mother, had seen the injustice and felt powerless to stop it, but offered the only help she could. In the city, they slept their first night inside a church compound, curled beneath a broken bench while mosquitoes tore into their skin. Chidinma watched her daughter sleep and felt the rage boil. Her daughter was born into love, a marriage that started with hope and faith, and now she was being raised by hunger, shame, and fear. But she made a vow that night, staring at the church ceiling. Ijeoma would not grow up bitter. She would not carry this pain forever. Chidinma would fight for her joy, even if it cost her everything. Finding food was a daily battle. Chidinma took up washing clothes on the street for tenants, cleaning restaurant floors before sunrise, even carrying headpans for market women at dawn. Some mocked her accent. Some mocked her torn wrapper. Some men offered to help in exchange for her body. But she refused to let poverty rob her of her dignity. With each rejection, she grew more determined. Ijeoma, though young, quickly adapted. She fetched water, sold sachet water, even swept stalls to earn a few coins. They shared a single meal a day, often soaked Gary with a pinch of salt. But in those moments, Chadinma held onto her faith and her daughter's laughter. Sometimes, when Ijeoma drew in the sand or hummed old lullabies, Chadinma would close her eyes and imagine Emeka's voice, reminding her to be strong. He was gone, yes, but his dream, their love, lived on, in the fragile but unbreakable spirit of their daughter. Obiora never truly mourned his brother, not in the way true grief strips a man down and breaks a soul. His mourning was rehearsed, his tears summoned by convenience. In the weeks that followed Emeka's burial, he strutted around the village like a man who had slain a rival in battle, and now claimed his spoils. The compound once filled with laughter and children's play fell silent, swallowed by weeds and cobwebs. The elders, now comfortably under his thumb, began calling him the man of the house. He wasted no time reclaiming Emeka's lands, vehicles, even his office desk, everything, except the memory of his brother's wife, which haunted him night after night. His obsession with Chidinma, long suppressed under layers of jealousy and inferiority, had now become feral. In his twisted mind, she was the final prize. He had taken the life, taken the land, but her body was the final conquest. What he hadn't taken by force, he believed, he could now seize by entitlement. It was during one of his drunken nights that he staggered to the village square and declared publicly, "I will marry her. It is my right. Who else should take care of my brother's widow?" Some villagers nodded, some kept silent, and a few brave ones raised their brows. But Obiora was untouchable now. Backed by wealth and cowardly elders, he saw no wrong in his desires. He began visiting Chidinma's abandoned compound regularly, sometimes sitting by the gate, sometimes entering the house with a fake priest to cleanse it of curses. One evening, before Chadinma fled to the city, she returned to collect Ijeoma's school certificates. As she stepped out of the house, Obiora appeared, leaning against the gate. "I knew you'd come back," he whispered, stepping too close. "This is your home, and I am your new husband. Stop fighting the destiny your husband left for you." Chadinma's eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she spit at his feet and walked away. "You will choke on your own greed one day," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Humiliated, Obiora raged like a wounded animal. He called on the village council the very next day, accusing Chadinma of abandoning her husband's legacy, defiling their tradition, and raising a cursed child. He bribed the head elder to organize a fake spiritual declaration that claimed her presence brought death. Within a week, a formal notice was drawn. The village council, now no more than puppets, summoned Chidinma. They gave her two options: marry Obiora and remain in the compound, or leave and renounce all claims to Emeka's land and legacy. Chidinma stood silent before them, holding Ijeoma's hand. "I will leave," she said calmly, "but know this, one day I will return. And when I do, your goats will flee, your wells will dry, and this land will remember what you all did." With nothing left to say, she turned and walked out again, but this time, not as a victim. She walked with the strength of fire in her bones. The eviction was swift, brutal, and public. On a bright Monday morning, while villagers fetched water and opened their market stalls, Chadinma and Ijeoma were dragged to the village square once again. Only this time, no one wept for them. Two guards paid by Obiora grabbed their few remaining possessions and tossed them onto a cart. Ijeoma tried to run back into her father's house to grab his framed photograph, but a hand pulled her back violently. Chidinma rushed to defend her daughter and was slapped by one of the guards. Her lips bled, but her eyes remained dry. The village elders sat in judgmental silence, their mouths reeking of palm wine and hypocrisy. "It is done," one of them said, slamming his staff on the ground. "She has rejected our offer of covering, and so she must go. The gods will decide her fate." Obiora stood behind them, arms folded, grinning like a cat who had swallowed the bird. As they walked through the village path, again barefoot, again disgraced, the echoes of murmurs surrounded them. Some people whispered in pity, others in contempt. "Is it not her fault? She should have married him. What is dignity when you're homeless? That girl will suffer, oh." But Chadinma didn't flinch. Her lips moved silently in prayer, her arms tightly wrapped around her daughter. Ijeoma asked no questions this time. She was older now, aware in ways no child should be. She held the photograph of her father tightly, refusing to let it go even as they reached the edge of the village road. A bus passed, and Chidinma flagged it down. The driver, an old man who recognized her, hesitated but eventually opened the door. As the bus moved, Chidinma looked back, one final glance at the place where her life had shattered. "Goodbye," she whispered. "You took everything. Now watch what I build from nothing." They arrived at the city again, this time with no church gates waiting for them, no cousin to offer help. But something was different. Chadinma's spirit had hardened. She found an abandoned mechanic shed and cleaned it, turning it into shelter for the night. She began working again, this time in a factory that paid her enough to eat once a day. Ijeoma was enrolled in a public school with worn benches and leaking roofs. But she studied harder than everyone else. Her pain became her fuel. Chidinma saved every naira, bought a second-hand sewing machine, and began tailoring again in the evenings. They were still poor, still mocked, but now they had a plan. They were no longer surviving to escape their past. They were surviving to rewrite it. And somewhere deep inside the heart of that mother and daughter, a quiet revolution had begun. The early days in the city were the hardest. Chadinma and Ijeoma drifted between motor parks and unfinished buildings, their backs against cold concrete, their futures scribbled on the walls of uncertainty. At night, the city roared with life, yet none of it belonged to them. They weren't part of the crowd that laughed at beer parlors or the ones that lived behind gated fences. They were the invisible, another homeless woman and child sleeping with slippers as pillows, clutching each other against mosquitoes and stray dogs. Rain was their greatest enemy. Whenever the sky darkened, Chadinma would rush to find an overhead bridge or abandoned kiosk to hide in. Some nights, there was no shelter, and they would sit in silence beneath leaking zinc, soaked to the bone, praying morning would come quickly. Food was a luxury. Some days, it came from leftovers in restaurant bins. Other times, kind strangers offered slices of bread or sachets of water. Still, Chadinma refused to beg. Her hands remained busy, scrubbing, cleaning, mending, doing anything that could feed her daughter with dignity. Ijeoma adjusted in ways no child should ever have to. She stopped crying at night. She stopped asking about her toys or her old bedroom. Instead, she learned to sell sachet water in traffic, weaving through honking cars and cursing drivers. She memorized the best bus stops to sell during rush hour and made sure to keep her coins hidden in her shoe. Once, a boy tried to steal her small nylon bag of earnings, but she bit his arm and ran. When she returned to her mother that night with a bleeding lip and swollen cheek, Chadinma wept, not because of the injury, but because her daughter was growing up in war mode. Gone were the lullabies, the fairy tales. Their world had become survival first. Yet in all the chaos, something sacred remained, their bond. Each night, no matter where they laid their heads, Chadinma would pull Ijeoma close and whisper, "We are not animals. We are not cursed. We are just wounded. But wounds heal." Those words, quiet and trembling, were their lullaby now. Eventually, they found a more stable shelter, a run-down room behind a carpenter's workshop. It had no door, only a curtain, and the floor was made of cracked concrete, but it was something. Chidinma paid weekly with her factory earnings, and during the evenings, she resumed her old love, tailoring. She repaired torn trousers for taxi drivers, stitched uniforms for school children, and rebranded herself as Mama Obiora the seamstress. Her first major breakthrough came when she convinced a local church choir to let her sew their robes for a discounted fee. The fabric was cheap, but her hands were skilled. The choir's leader, an elderly woman named Mama Nkechi, was so impressed that she told others. That one robe led to 3 more, then 5, then 20. Chadinma began to earn more than her factory job and eventually quit it altogether. The tailoring brought her home to herself again. Her back still ached, her bones still protested, but the joy of sitting before a sewing machine, shaping torn pieces into beauty, reminded her that she was not finished, not yet. If the city had taught Obiora anything, it was that education was the only weapon no one could steal from her. She clung to her books like oxygen. In the morning, she would rise before dawn, boil Gary over a borrowed charcoal stove, and walk miles to her public school in oversized slippers. Her uniform, patched and faded, hung loosely on her small frame, and her school bag was a repurposed fertilizer sack stitched carefully by her mother. The other students mocked her, their laughter cruel and frequent. Gary Brain, they would chant, or bend down select student. But Obiora didn't respond. Instead, she buried herself in math problems and science texts. Her teachers began to notice her. She was the first to finish her assignments, the only one who asked complex questions, and often stayed back after class just to read more. When her mother couldn't afford textbooks, Obiora would copy entire chapters from borrowed books into old jotters. Her handwriting was neat, disciplined, and relentless, like her spirit. At a statewide quiz competition held at the town hall, Obiora stunned the judges. She answered questions on current affairs, algebra, and biology with ease. The audience murmured in awe, and when she was asked where she schooled, she whispered, "Community Primary School, Zone 5." The other contestants wore blazers and polished shoes. She wore worn-out sandals and a dress with threadbare sleeves. Yet it was her voice, her mind, her poise that stole the spotlight. She didn't just win the quiz, she shattered stereotypes. One of the judges, a woman named Mrs. Angela Odiu, who worked with an education-focused NGO, walked up to her afterward. "Where are your parents?" she asked. Obiora hesitated, then pointed toward the edge of the room where her mother stood, fingers nervously wringing her wrapper. When Mrs. Odiu walked up to Chadinma, she asked gently, "Is she yours?" Chadinma nodded with cautious pride. Mrs. Odiu smiled. "She's a gem, and she belongs in a better school." That day marked the beginning of a new chapter, one written not with suffering, but with possibilities. Through the NGO scholarship program, Obiora was enrolled in Cedar Springs International College, a private boarding school known for its elite standards. On her first day, she stood at the school gate in her new uniform, still unsure if she belonged. The dormitory had real beds, the bathrooms had hot water, and the classrooms had projectors and digital boards. She clutched her new school bag like it might disappear. But when she sat for her first test and scored the highest in the class, she realized that her brilliance wasn't an accident. She belonged here not because of privilege, but because of perseverance. Her name started appearing on honor boards. Teachers praised her in staff meetings. Peers who once ignored her now asked for her help. Every milestone she achieved, she shared with her mother through long, handwritten letters. "Mama," she wrote once, "they called me poor, but I am rich in knowledge. And one day, I'll be rich in truth and justice too." Back in the village, Obiora had transformed Emeka's legacy into a grotesque monument to his greed. The once peaceful compound now looked like a war bunker, walls fortified, gates electrified, and guards stationed around the clock. He had erected new structures on the land, plastered his name across Emeka's business signboards, and boasted about his rise from ashes to anyone who would listen. The village elders, still benefiting from his pockets, praised him as a true man of legacy. But beneath the marble tiles and polished floors, Obiora's conscience was rotting. He could not sleep through the night without hearing Emeka's voice in his dreams. Sometimes he would wake drenched in sweat, seeing Chidinma's eyes staring at him from the shadows. He began to avoid mirrors, believing they whispered curses. Yet, outwardly, he laughed louder, threw bigger parties, and poured more wine, anything to drown the guilt that had become a living, breathing companion. His paranoia grew. He banned the mention of Emika's name anywhere in his home or compound. Anyone caught reminiscing about the past was fired or banished. "That name is dead," he would bark, "and it must stay buried." He had alienated his own family in the process. His sons, who once admired their Uncle Emika, now stayed away, seeing through the lies their father had told. His wife no longer slept in the same room. She, too, had begun to suspect the truth. There were whispers, rumors circulating about that night of the robbery, about the elders' rushed decisions, about Chadinma's disgrace. A few villagers still spoke in hushed tones at night markets, careful not to be heard. The land had not forgotten. It had soaked Emika's blood, and now it rejected the thief who walked over it with pride. And yet, Obiora continued to wear his mask of power. He sponsored church harvests, donated to schools, even started a local scholarship fund to clean his image. But deep down, he knew his kingdom was built on blood and sand. Every pillar, every brick, stood on a foundation of betrayal. The more he built, the emptier he felt. He had everything, land, wealth, titles, but peace eluded him. And somewhere, beneath the city skyline, the girl he once threw into the dust was slowly rising. Not with rage, but with purpose. Her hands were not carrying weapons. They were building futures. Her mother was not seeking revenge. She was rebuilding justice. And the same land Obiora claimed to own? It would one day kneel before the name he tried so hard to erase. The hourglass had turned, and time, like truth, was no longer on his side. The years passed like folded pages of a tattered novel, full of smudges, heartbreaks, and silent victories. Chidinma, now in her early 40s, wore her pain like armor. Her skin bore the marks of endurance, her eyes the wisdom of sorrow, and her smile, though rare, radiated the calm strength of a woman who had seen the very bottom of life and survived it. She no longer chased approval, nor did she bother explaining herself to the world. Instead, she devoted her time to helping the weak, the invisible ones like she once was. After years of tailoring and saving meticulously, she enrolled in evening paralegal training. It began as a curiosity, but evolved into a calling. Every landlord who threatened a widow, every street vendor unjustly arrested, every market woman slapped by police, Chadinma found a way to help them. People began calling her Mama Law. She didn't wear a wig or own a briefcase, but her voice silenced bullies and opened doors. Meanwhile, Ijeoma was blossoming. By age 22, she had graduated with honors in agricultural technology and had developed a fascination for urban farming. She saw how hunger had humiliated her mother and wanted to reverse that narrative for others. Instead of joining a multinational firm, as many expected, she created GreenSoul, a startup focused on converting urban rooftops and abandoned city lots into high-yield crop farms. Her early projects were funded by grants won through competitions. She designed portable systems that allowed poor households to grow vegetables in small buckets, even in slums. Soon, she began getting media attention. A viral TED-style talk titled "The Soil That Raised Me Wasn't Fertile, But I Bloomed Anyway" made her name known nationwide. Articles were written. Investors called. Doors opened. But with each success, Ijeoma always returned home, not to her old village, but to Chidinma, her compass, her constant. They would sit together in their small apartment, sharing roasted corn and talking about land. How one man had tried to bury them beneath it, and how one day it would bow to them. That day came sooner than expected. While browsing a land acquisition registry for one of her expansion projects, Ijeoma stumbled on a name, Obiora Nwankwo. It was on nearly every parcel she was interested in across their ancestral region. For a moment, her blood ran cold. Not because she feared him, but because seeing his name, again so arrogantly sprawled across documents and deeds, reminded her of what he had stolen. She didn't tell her mother right away. Instead, she began purchasing land around his holdings, quietly, strategically, and always through third-party channels. With the help of a legal friend from her university days, she began to investigate property records, death certificates, elders' testimonies, everything. The deeper they dug, the more corruption surfaced. Bribes, forged signatures, council resolutions made behind closed doors. Ijeoma printed it all, stored it in a black leather file, and tucked it beneath her bed. One day, she would lay it all before her mother and say, "It's time to go home." Green Soul wasn't just a company anymore, it was a movement. Ijeoma's innovative agricultural systems were now being used in over 13 states, from Lagos to Kaduna. She was featured in Forbes Africa's 30 Under 30, nominated for a Continental Innovation Award, and even invited to speak at international panels. But she never dressed like wealth had touched her. Her wardrobe remained simple, modest gowns, anchor tops, and the same sandals she had worn years ago when she'd launched her first rooftop farm. Journalists kept asking for her origin story, and each time she gave a version of the truth. "I was raised by a woman who refused to let society kill her spirit." She never once mentioned Obiora, never once hinted at the violence, betrayal, and humiliation they had endured. Not yet. She was waiting, not for revenge, but for precision, for justice to taste like salt on a wound, not sweetness on the tongue. When she eventually revealed her plans to her mother, they sat under the same mango tree they had once cried beneath years ago. Chidinma's hands trembled as she flipped through the file of evidence Ijeoma had assembled. Every photo, every signature, every dusty document was a mirror reflecting their stolen past. But she didn't cry. Instead, she looked at her daughter with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I thought I was raising a child," she whispered. "But I see now I was raising a storm." Ijeoma smiled softly. "You were raising a queen, Mama, and it's time she claims her throne." Together, they drafted a strategy, not just legal, but cultural. Ijeoma purchased every plot surrounding Obiora's primary residence. She made donations to local development projects under a different name. She even sponsored a youth center in the village, again anonymously. Obiora didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. Then came the day Obiora received a legal notice requesting his presence at a regional land review. He scoffed, assuming it was another boring formality. But when he arrived, he saw a familiar face sitting quietly at the back of the hall. It took him a full minute to realize it was Ijeoma, grown, beautiful, and unrecognizable only to those who had never cared to look. His smirk faded. She didn't approach him. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded, and the proceedings began. As the evidence was laid out piece by piece, illegally signed deeds, missing council meeting records, fraudulently transferred ownership, Obiora began to sweat. For the first time in 2 decades, the crowd wasn't clapping for him. They were murmuring, watching, judging. He stood up to protest, but the panel cut him off. "Mr. Nwankwo," they said, "we advise you sit. This hearing has just begun." It didn't take long for Obiora's empire to begin crumbling, first in whispers, then in waves. After the hearing, the village and regional elders called for a formal land review. Chadinma, now referred to as Madam Chadinma by the legal team, was asked to testify. She walked into the courtroom with quiet dignity, wearing a simple lace blouse and a head wrap. As she took the stand, even the most corrupt among the elders could not meet her gaze. With calm clarity, she narrated everything. Her husband's death, the night she was dragged out of her home, Obiora's vile proposal at her husband's grave, and how they had survived homelessness. There was no rage in her voice, just truth. And truth, when spoken without vengeance, carries the weight of thunder. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional sniffle from those ashamed of their past complicity. Her story, now recorded and televised, began to spread like wildfire. Obiora, desperate to save face, held a press conference days later. He claimed he had done what was necessary to preserve the family legacy. But public opinion was no longer on his side. The villagers began to whisper openly. Old friends kept their distance. His wife packed her bags and left. His sons issued a public statement distancing themselves from his actions. One of the thugs, who had been part of Emika's assassination attempt, was finally tracked down, broken, dying of illness, and willing to confess. In a tearful video, he recounted the job Obiora paid him for and the night they carried out the attack. With that confession, police reopened the murder case. Obiora was arrested in his mansion by officers who once used to shake his hands. His face appeared on the evening news, not as a philanthropist, but as a man accused of murder, land fraud, and unlawful eviction. Meanwhile, Chidinma returned to the village, but this time as a landowner, not a fugitive. She wore her father's name like a badge of honor and walked the same path they had once been dragged through in shame. The children followed her like she was a queen. Women wept and kissed her hands. The same elders who once cursed her now bowed and offered kola nuts in apology. But she took none of it. Instead, she walked to the center of the family compound, turned to the crowd, and declared, "This is not about revenge. It's about memory. It's about truth. And the soil that once rejected us will now bear our name in gold." And in that moment, under the same sun that had once watched them weep, the mask that Obiora wore for decades fell completely, shattered by the strength of the very people he thought he had destroyed. The morning Chadinma and Chidinma returned to their ancestral compound was unusually still, as if the soil itself held its breath. It had been exactly 20 years since they were dragged through that same village square like criminals, mocked, humiliated, and cast out with nothing but disgrace and a child's tears. Now, they arrived in a sleek black SUV, flanked by media, local youths, and a delegation of legal observers. Chidinma, dressed in a deep green blouse and a long wrapper patterned in gold, stepped out first. Chadinma followed, her head wrap tied neatly, her eyes sharp but composed. As they walked past the mango tree, women who had once gossiped behind their backs now knelt in apology. Some wept, some sang, some simply bowed their heads in shame. Elders gathered quietly under the village's large thatch canopy, shifting uncomfortably as the memories they had buried clawed back to life in full force. Obiora's mansion now looked like a monument of guilt, grand but hollow. Chidinma had legally reclaimed a massive portion of the surrounding lands and had obtained a court order that placed the compound under state review. A massive banner hung across the gate read, "This property is under investigation." The villagers watched as she unfurled a leather document holder and presented her father's original deed, her mother's eviction notice, and the criminal confessions that led to Obiora's arrest. With the documents in hand, the village chief, who had once sanctioned their disgrace, stood up awkwardly and stammered, "The land belongs to the daughter now." There was no applause, no ceremony, just silence, deep and pregnant with realization. Chidinma stood behind her daughter, hands clasped tightly, trembling but strong. For her, this was not triumph, it was closure. She had not come to punish, but to reclaim. And as they stepped into the compound, crossing the very threshold they had once been dragged from, the wind picked up softly, almost as if Emika's spirit had returned with them. Inside, the air was heavy with memories. Every corner still bore traces of the life they once knew, now faded by dust and time. The backyard mango tree still stood, its roots gnarled and proud, the same tree under which Emika once swung Ikena and told him bedtime stories. Chidinma walked into what used to be her room, now turned into a storeroom for old furniture. She closed her eyes and let a tear roll down. "I'm back, Papa," she whispered. Chadinma, meanwhile, entered the master bedroom and saw the wall where her wedding photo had once hung. The nail was still there. She stood silently for a while before pulling a framed picture from her bag, a portrait of Emika smiling, his eyes full of hope. She placed it gently back on the wall, right where it belonged. No fanfare, no declaration, just restoration. That evening, mother and daughter sat side by side in the compound, watching the sunset. The shadows of the past no longer hovered. They had confronted the ghost. And this time, they didn't flinch. The trial began less than a month after Obiora's arrest. The court was packed with journalists, activists, and villagers who had made the long journey just to see if justice, so long denied, would finally speak. Obiora sat in the dock, his face sunken, his eyes red-rimmed, and his once proud shoulders slouched with the weight of truth. Gone was the boastful man who once laughed at funerals and issued threats in whispers. He wore a faded white kaftan and chain shackles. His lawyer tried to argue that the confession of the dying thug was coerced, and that Chadinma's eviction had been a customary matter, not criminal. But the prosecution was relentless. They presented signed documents, testimonies from villagers, secret audio recordings of Obiora making lewd proposals to Chidinma, everything. There were gasps in court, tears, and even audible prayers as the truth came out piece by piece. The judge, a woman known for her intolerance of corruption, listened intently, her face expressionless but her eyes blazing. When Chidinma took the stand, the entire courtroom fell into stillness. She told her story not with rage but with heartbreaking detail, how she watched her husband die, how she held her dying son's hand, how she was offered as a second wife to her husband's killer, and how she and her daughter had slept on street corners and church pews. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It only held weight, like a hymn sung by a mother over her son's grave. When she stepped down, the judge leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Chidinma, this court acknowledges your courage." Then Ijeoma was called to testify. She narrated her childhood, the hunger, the mockery, the fire that grew inside her with every insult. She showed the court her academic records, her startup achievements, her foundation work. "I didn't return for revenge," she concluded. "I returned to show that no lie lives forever." The courtroom burst into quiet applause before the judge banged the gavel. The final ruling sent shockwaves across the region. Obiora was sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder, illegal land acquisition, and unlawful eviction. The judge declared that his actions had not only destroyed a family, but had nearly destroyed a community's moral compass. The court also ordered the full return of all properties and assets stolen from Emeka's family to Chadinma and Ijeoma, plus damages. Obiora didn't cry. He didn't speak. He only stared straight ahead, his lips quivering. As he was led away, Ijeoma stood and watched him without a word, not out of hatred, but out of recognition. This man, who had tried to bury her future, had now been buried by the very truth he ran from. And justice, though late, had finally spoken in full. The return to the compound after the trial was unlike the first. This time, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't shadowed by grief or judgment. It was loud. It was triumphant. Hundreds of people followed Ijeoma and Chadinma through the village gates, singing songs of praise and ululation. Women laid wrappers on the ground for them to walk on. Children waved palm fronds. Even the skeptical elders had come, this time not to curse, but to honor. A village that once turned its back now opened its arms. As they arrived at the family compound, drummers played, and the local priest offered a blessing. Ijeoma held her mother's hand tightly, eyes full of tears. "You said we'd return one day," she whispered. "You didn't just keep that promise, Mama. You made me believe I could do the impossible." Chadinma didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the sky, then said, "Your father would be proud. He would know his death didn't kill us, it planted us." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the compound glowed in orange hues, a memorial service was held for Emeka and Ikena. Candles were lit, names were called, and silence fell like a blanket over the crowd. Chadinma knelt beside Emeka's grave, now polished and engraved with words, a man of truth, betrayed by blood, immortalized by love. Ijeoma placed a single rose beside it and whispered, "Your daughter made it, Papa. We are no longer beggars." That night they held a vigil. Villagers came to tell stories of Emeka's kindness, his laughter, and the gap he left behind. It wasn't just a funeral. It was a resurrection. The family name had been restored, and not through vengeance, but through vision. From nothing, they had built an empire. From shame, they had carved a legacy. And from ashes, they had risen like queens reclaiming a throne denied. Ijeoma later announced the launch of the Emeka Nwankwo Foundation, focused on providing scholarships to orphans and children of widows. The foundation's headquarters would be built right on the very land Obiora tried to steal. Plans were drawn for a vocational center and a tech farm that would employ over 100 local youths. As the villagers clapped and danced, Chidinma stood back quietly, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. For the first time in 20 years, she felt whole. No longer a victim. No longer hiding. No longer reduced to what was done to her. She had watched her daughter become everything Obiora said she could never be. And in doing so, she had fulfilled the one vow that had kept her alive, to return with dignity, not vengeance. The story that once began with disgrace had now been rewritten in gold. And the land that once rejected her now bore her name and blessings. Obiora Nwankwo sat in the cold corner of his prison cell, his back against the peeling wall, staring at nothing. The once proud man, who strutted through village meetings with his head held high, was now reduced to a shadow, an aging body haunted by decisions he could no longer justify. The whispers of other inmates didn't bother him. It was the silence that did. The nights when everything went still, and he could hear Emeka's laughter in his head. The nights when Ikena's innocent eyes appeared in his dreams, questioning. The guilt that he buried for years had come alive, gnawing at his insides like termites in dry wood. He thought the world had forgotten Emeka. He believed time would bury truth. But truth, as he now realized, had roots deeper than he imagined. And now he was not just forgotten, he was discarded. Even his own children had stopped visiting. His wife had quietly divorced him after the sentencing. She returned to her people, leaving behind a single letter that read, "You killed your brother. You killed our peace. And now you live in the grave you dug yourself." His sons, now grown men, disassociated themselves publicly. "We are not our father," one of them said in an interview. "We will make restitution in our own way." And they did. They donated a portion of their inheritance to the Emeka Nwankwo Foundation, expressing solidarity with Ijeoma's vision. That act alone was enough to strip Obiora of the last illusion he held, that his bloodline would carry on his version of the truth. Now even the community he once ruled like a local king refused to mention his name in public. When elders told stories of the past, they paused when his name came up. It wasn't silence out of respect, it was silence out of shame. In his final months behind bars, Obiora was transferred to a correctional farm where inmates worked the land daily. He, the man who stole his brother's land, now tilled soil not his own. Irony curled itself around every stroke of the hoe, every turn of the spade. Sometimes he would pause, his knees aching, the sun hot on his back, and he would whisper Emeka's name, not to curse him, but to ask for forgiveness. No answer ever came. And so, when news finally reached the village that Obiora had died quietly in prison from an untreated infection, there was no announcement, no vigil, no mourning. His body was buried in an unmarked prison grave, miles away from the land he once fought over. And like a faded shadow chased by sunlight, he vanished, banished not just by the law, but by memory. The man who once called himself master of the house had no house, no legacy, no name worth preserving. In the heart of the village now stood a new building, clean, modern, and painted in calming earth tones. The golden sign above its entrance read, "The Emeka Nwankwo Foundation for Justice and Hope." Inside, children filled the classrooms, widows were trained in trade skills, and local farmers learned about sustainable agriculture. The walls were lined with pictures, not just of Ijeoma's achievements, but of Emeka, Ikena, and Chadinma in her earlier years. The story of a family nearly erased by envy had become the cornerstone of a new generation's empowerment. On the compound's far edge, a bronze statue stood, Emeka holding a book in one hand and a small child in the other. At its base were the words, "Truth buried in silence will always rise in time." The villagers now used that quote in their daily proverbs, passing it down to their children. The land that once rejected Emeka's family now bore their legacy like a crown. Ijeoma, now 32, stood tall as the founder and CEO of Green Soul Global. She had expanded her agricultural innovation firm to other African countries, receiving awards and honors internationally. But despite the applause and accolades, her greatest pride remained in that village, among the people who once watched her flee barefoot behind her mother. Every year, on the anniversary of their return, she held a day of truth, where people came to tell stories of healing, injustice, and recovery. It became more than just a commemoration. It became a movement. On one such anniversary, she walked into the main hall of the foundation to find her mother staring at a framed newspaper article titled, "The Girl He Threw Out Built an Empire on the Land He Tried to Steal." Chidinma smiled, but said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes told 1,000 stories. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Obiora and Chadinma sat on the veranda, their chairs side by side, their hearts full. They looked out over the compound Emeka once built, now rebuilt stronger than ever. Chidinma turned and whispered, "We lost everything, but we never lost ourselves." Obiora nodded. "And because of that, we gained more than they ever imagined." Behind them, children's laughter echoed, seeds were being planted in rich soil, and hope breathed through every brick and branch. The story that began with betrayal and ashes had ended with a name etched, not just in land deeds, but in hearts and history. And as the stars slowly lit up the night sky, mother and daughter sat in silence, knowing that even though Emeka was gone, his truth lived on. Not in revenge, not in bitterness, but in legacy. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.